So it occurred to me really that the history of ideas, the history of thought, really is underpinned by two fundamental paradigms. The one paradigm which is dominant in our culture at the moment could simply be described as materialism. So that reality is conceived of as being fundamentally simply matter, and since Einstein that's equivalent to energy. So the sort of unconscious matter and energy pervading the entire universe, and that's what it is. And out of that unconscious matter miraculously appears, in a tiny corner of an absolutely vast universe, a tiny corner appears life. Mm-hmm. And that's a bit of a mystery and a bit of a miracle. And from life also emerges consciousness, mind. And that's a profound miracle and mystery, known as the hard problem of consciousness. Mm-hmm. And then the further development of that, in our particular species, we seem to have the capacity for not only consciousness, but self-consciousness, mm-hmm. self-awareness.
Can you actually define what, at that point, from that point of view, what consciousness would be considered to be?
Well, the trouble with it is that in a certain sense we all know what consciousness is, because it's the most...
I do.
Well...
But I don't know what it is. No, actually, I really don't know what it is.
If you consider it to be some kind of objective phenomena, then a materialistic viewpoint would say, well, it's just the byproduct of brain activity.
But what is it actually?
When you ask the question what something is, you have to answer it in terms of something else. Uh-huh. When you're giving a description of something, okay. You say, what is it?
Yeah.
You have to, unless it's something which is absolutely primary and mm-hmm. indefinable, then you're trying to define it and talk about it in terms of something else that you're more familiar with.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah. So if you think of consciousness as some kind of strange, bizarre phenomena, then you need, if you want to know what it is, in that sense you're asking the question of, please describe it to me mm-hmm. in terms that I understand, or in terms of something that I do know what it is. So in that sense, consciousness is always going to be regarded as something explained, a byproduct mm-hmm. of something. And the materialist view is that it is a byproduct of brain activity. Mm-hmm. And they would say, well, of course, it comprises everything in terms of the content of our consciousness. It's everything we think, see, feel, touch, taste, the concepts, the percepts, everything, the whole caboodle.
Okay. So you could put it in the context of its experience. You could say everything that we experience.
Yes, you could. You could say it's everything that we experience, and that's going to be an interesting thing.
Okay, so that's good to be clear about that. Yeah.
Yeah. So, as I said, the materialist viewpoint would have it that consciousness, or our experiences, arises from something that is fundamentally not conscious. Mm-hmm. You know, matter, energy, the activity of the brain, and mm-hmm. so on. So the world is that way up. You can think of it as matter and energy as the sort of bottom strata,
right?
And then, and that comprises most of the vast universe. And then, in a tiny corner of the universe, emerging from that matter, appears to be the phenomena of life, which is self-replicating matter. And then, yet another tiny proportion of that seems to give rise to what we would call consciousness. Consciousness in animals and in ourselves.
Right, so there's a clear delineation when that starts and when it stops.
I wouldn't say it was clear. I wouldn't say it was clear delineation, but there is a delineation somewhere.
But, for example, a tree. You wouldn't say a tree has consciousness. In other words, something that doesn't have a brain or a nervous system or an ability to experience, an obvious ability to experience something.
I think you'd probably be stretching it a bit to say that a tree or a plant was conscious. But then we have had all of that research into the secret life of plants and how they do actually respond.
And a jellyfish, but it doesn't seem to have a nervous system.
Yes. So it's an open question as to whether there's anything that we would recognise as consciousness going on there.
Yeah,
As
I mean, this
opposed
is,
to
obviously this is something that comes up in my work with babies and stuff, and like where does that begin, in terms of development, and
Right.
it's an interesting philosophical, well, not it's a practical question about when you're working with people, where does, for example, memory begin? Now, in the
Yes.
development of an embryo, when you've got a merging of two cells, the nervous system comes quite a bit later in the development.
right.
And so where does consciousness start in that case?
Yes.
Where does memory start? And memory appears to start
Right.
much earlier than a nervous system, or
Right.
an ability to perceive anything,
Right.
a physical ability to perceive anything.
Right.
So I think, it has practical connotations as
Oh,
well,
yes,
because
definitely.
also when you're talking about like things that shape us, for example,
Yes.
experiences that shape us, say in the womb or something, those are very, very powerful, and they seem to have something that goes way beyond an ability that we understand to perceive something, or
Right.
sort of process something on a nervous system level.
Right. Right.
Anyway, but it's a slight digression, but I think it's...
Well, it's
not,
actually,
but
well, it's not really. It's a very profound question. I mean, it's interesting if you look back in the history of ideas about this. Descartes, for example, thought that really only human beings were properly conscious,
Yeah,
and that even animals, dogs and cats, were automata.
Yeah.
They didn't really have a soul,
right,
and that all of their reactions and responses were mechanical.
yeah,
And there was no light on.
Yeah.
I don't think we really believe that anymore. Anybody who's got a cat or
Yeah.
a dog is not going to say that they're not conscious.
But it's very different from more ancient traditions where it was considered, let's say, the sun has consciousness, or lakes, or mountains
Yes.
have consciousness, or
Yes.
or trees, or all
Yes.
kinds of spirits, and all this kind of stuff.
Yes,
That's
exactly.
been pervasive through history up to what,
Right.
200 years ago or something? I don't know.
Well, exactly. So I was going to contrast the materialist paradigm
Yeah.
that I just outlined in the broadest possible brushstrokes with a much older paradigm, which has actually dominated our history for millennia,
Yeah,
which is that life or consciousness, in some sense, is primary, in that everything has arisen as the manifestation or the creation of a divine consciousness, a God, a creator spirit, maybe more than one. So the idea that the basic idea is that consciousness, life, is primary, and that this material world is an act of creation or an act of manifestation of that consciousness, and so matter is like the final evolution of the process of manifestation.
Right.
So the world's the other way up. The reality is the other way up.
yeah,
Instead of matter being the substratum, and life and mind and consciousness sort of
Yeah.
arise as a remarkable and very limited phenomena.
yeah. So that view you're talking about is presumably a very ancient view. You find it in a lot of
Yes.
religious or...
Yes, I mean nearly.
Text.
I mean, a religion by definition would. I suppose the general philosophical term would be to call it idealism in some form.
Uh-huh.
But this is all the idea or the manifestation of the consciousness of God,
Right, yeah.
and that there are any number of ways in which that's described. You can look at ancient Indian philosophies. It's an impersonal Brahman, the
Yeah.
impersonal absolute reality. You can look at Greek philosophers, where it's the manifestation of the one, the shining of the one through various stages of manifestation. Same in Kashmir Shaivism. So right across the world,
Right.
and through all cultures, that has been the predominant paradigm
Yeah.
through most of human history. And it's really only the power of science and technology in the last couple of centuries which has so impressed us and so changed the way we live,
Yeah,
that by thinking of the world as being objective and material,
yeah,
we get a handle on it in a way that we never seemed to get a handle on it before, in terms of our ability to master nature or control it.
but I suppose when you bring in the aspect of God or one or whatever it is, then there is another, isn't there, which in itself contains consciousness. So if there's a God has some consciousness, assuming,
Yes.
or because it's something
Yes.
else, that has some consciousness of everything,
Yes.
and therefore that brings in a different element to it. It brings in the possibility that consciousness is all pervasive in a way.
Yes.
That it's not limited to this individual being.
Yes.
That it is everywhere.
Yes. I mean, we're even reverting to that view of things. Panpsychism, they call it, that consciousness actually pervades every level of reality. And there are even scientific, thinkers now. Like Rupert Sheldrake, for example, is a good example where everything is basically pervaded by consciousness in various forms.
So what does that mean then? So within the very nature of existence, there is a kind of knowing somehow, or there is an awareness, or there is. Is that what it means? When you say it's all pervaded by consciousness, what does that mean?
It's a good question. I mean, I think people mean by it different things.
Uh-huh.
There is a rather simplistic way of thinking of it as kind of like the substratum from which everything is made. Now that's a very gross idea, really. It's a very clumsy idea. It's like saying that, you've got a beach that's all sand, and you make different sculptures out of sand, and whatever they are, whatever form they take, they're all made of sand.
Yeah.
So you could say, well, consciousness pervades everything, and everything is consciousness in this form or that form or the other form.
But there is a sense of that in meditation, isn't there? Of everything being pervaded by something which has a kind of divine awareness to it, I suppose. There's that element, isn't there, that you get. That there is some kind of sense of deep knowing that is pervasive in everything.
Yes.
That is somehow almost indistinguishable from creation.
Yes, I mean the term that they traditionally use for it is that it's one. Reality is a manifestation of oneness, and that nothing is separate and nothing is isolated in that sense. Now, when we start talking about is pervaded by a kind of a knowing or a kind of an awareness, that might be a little bit more difficult to describe. Because at the same time, there is a sort of profound mystery as to how consciousness manifests. It seems to emerge from nothing in some sense, and in a certain sense we kind of only know the content of consciousness after the fact. In every night when we go into deep sleep, there seems to be a kind of a dissolution, and we can't honestly say, I don't think for the most part, that we're aware in deep sleep of being who we are in a state of deep sleep.
No,
there's a kind of unknowing. There's a kind of unknowingness happening there. So then, in the light of that, you might want to qualify what you say about consciousness being all pervading. Depends entirely what you mean by it, in terms of consciousness as we describe it and experience it in a waking state, or as in a dream, or in a dreamless sleep state. These are quite radically different.
But even in a deep sleep, there's when you wake up, there's an awareness that you were in a deep sleep. Otherwise, so there must have been some awareness at the time that you were in that state, or you had a dream about something.
There is that claim, although certainly a memory of a dream. But there are those who say, well, the only way you know you slept well is because of its effect on your psychophysical organism now, and that at the time you weren't aware of the fact that you were sleeping well.
Okay.
In terms of so there's those two paradigms. So I thought we could start by just knocking a few holes in the materialist paradigm, so that we can put consciousness more centre stage, rather than thinking of it as simply a rather inexplicable and bizarre manifestation happening on this planet in a tiny corner of the universe, and we don't know why. So that hierarchy that I described, with materialism, matter and energy at the base, and then life, consciousness, self-awareness. At each of those stages there are philosophical, scientific problems. traditionally, there's always been the question of, well, how did the creation come to be? And traditionally the answer has always been that it's the creation of a God.
Yeah.
Or manifestation of a divine consciousness or whatever. How does what's the equivalent from a materialist point of view? Well, not long ago there was a book published by an American cosmologist, Lawrence Krauss, called A Universe from Nothing. It's a fascinating read, and he's basically saying that the laws of physics as we understand them now allow us to describe and explain how the material universe could have arisen from absolutely nothing.
What's
And
it called?
it's just called A Universe from Nothing.
Universe from Nothing. Okay.
And basically, he's Lawrence Krauss is is a very leading, prominent atheist.
Right.
And so I think that one of the main motivations behind writing the book was to say that we don't need God to explain how everything arose. Physics does it all for us. Now, in point of fact, there are big holes in all that argument, because, first of all, if there is some primary element or material from which everything has arisen, it doesn't really make sense to talk about where that primary material came from. There isn't anywhere else if it's the primary material. Explanations have to stop somewhere. You can explain A in terms of B and B in terms of C, but unless it's going to be an infinite regress, there must come a point where something simply is, and you can't explain it in terms of anything else if it's going to get off the ground, to begin with. And so in point of fact, Lawrence Krauss is trying to present an argument that doesn't need presenting, because saying that God created the universe is not an answer either, because where did God come from? And if you say, well, he didn't come from anywhere because he's always been, well, the same could be said for the universe.
Yeah.
So why do we need God? I mean, if God could be there, eternally, maybe the universe is there eternally, and it doesn't need any more explanation than that. So in a sense, that the question of the origins is a bit moot, because it displays a lack of understanding about the nature of explanation itself.
Does he talk a lot in that book at all about the nature of nothing?
Yes, and in fact he sort of describes 3 levels of nothing.
Okay. Right.
I mean, I'll give you an example of one of them, because it would take too long otherwise. But it's quite interesting.
Yeah.
He says, for example, think of nothing as a physical vacuum, just completely empty space.
But even within that, there's something.
Yes, and what he would say was that the laws of physics, that particular Heisenberg's uncertainty principle in quantum mechanics, allows there to be, from a complete vacuum, a spontaneous manifestation of a particle, a charged particle, as long as within a very, very short period, as defined by the Heisenberg equation, as long as within a very short period of time there's an equal and opposite particle emerging, and then they cancel each other out and dissolve back into nothing. So the idea is that the universe then is a quantum fluctuation in a vacuum.
Right.
So it all arises out of nothing. Now, one analogy for that would be to say, well, it's a bit like being completely broke and having no money, but you have an overdraft facility, and with that overdraft facility, you can borrow some money and you can invest that money and create something, as long as it's paid back within a very short period of time.
Yeah.
And in fact, there are models of the universe where, through a process they call inflation, this whole universe has exploded from just such some quantum fluctuation. It's just one of the many models out there. So that's an example of something from nothing. But of course, it's not really something from nothing, because being absolutely flat broke and having an overdraft facility is not the same as being absolutely flat broke without one.
Yeah. Sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
So it's not nothing.
Yeah.
And it doesn't matter how sophisticated the arguments become. If your model of explanation is using the laws of physics, well, the laws of physics are there.
Yeah.
That's not nothing.
Yeah.
So anyway, in a philosophical sense, that ultimate question about the origins of things is sort of moot, really. Explanations have to stop somewhere.
Yeah.
And at some point you just have to say, well, this is how it is. Moving on from that, there are various problems about the mystery of how life emerged from inert matter or energy. And the standard model for all of that, of course, is evolution. And the idea being that given enough time, aeons, billions of years, random mutations can occur, and eventually just through molecules bumping into each other, they could form by complete coincidence a mechanism that could self-replicate. And if you just give it enough time, then that could happen. And then once that happens, that's the building blocks for life itself. There are actually problems with that. There's a book called The Arrival of the Latest, which is basically saying that if you crunch the numbers, there isn't enough time if it's just a random thing. So that, anyways, it's quite an interesting question. We don't have time to go into it now, but so there are problems about that explanation about how life could occur simply as a random mutation, giving rise to self-replicating structures.
And do any of these sort of notions about the void, or descriptions of the void, or emptiness, or nothingness, sort of correlate with anything in Buddhism or Kashmir Shaivism, or the Spanda kind of philosophy?
There's been a lot. I mean, I think going back as far as the Tao of Physics. Remember that book? Chopra. And there was another one, The Dancing Woolly Masters. Where there were lots of parallels being drawn between modern quantum physics and some of the ancient Eastern philosophical traditions. And everyone was very excited about it. If you actually look into the detail of it, it's not quite so clear that you can make an exact correspondence there.
And is there anything in the materialistic point of view that would say that that arising from nothing and dissolving, as it's described, is happening all the time? It wasn't just a single, like a progression. It's just that is the very nature of consciousness, that is always happening like that. Is that?
In terms of the materialist paradigm, you do have that, but you also get the Big Bang.
Right. So that's a point in time where that happened.
Yeah, sort of 14 billion years ago when. Right. And again, that's always been like, well, what happened before the Big Bang and what triggered it and all that. And there are various conceptual problems about why that's not really a sensible question to ask, because it's not that there was some kind of timeline and then the Big Bang happened. And because what happened at the Big Bang is that time itself appeared. Right. There was no time before. So in that sense, you can't really say that the Big Bang represents a set of initial conditions that created the universe. It's more that we are extrapolating backwards from an expanding universe, winding the clock back, and seeing that if we wind it far enough back, we get to what they call a singularity, where all the laws of physics break down. And we can't go beyond that. So that's not the same thing as saying that there was this event in time that caused everything that came after it. So it's a misunderstanding about what the Big Bang is actually supposed to describe in that way. But yes, in terms of the sort of soup of subatomic particles, that there's very much the idea that they're all coming in and out of existence continually. And
it's much more mainstream about the illusory nature of time now, isn't it?
Yes.
I mean, it has practical consequences, doesn't it? Like, with satellites going around the Earth, they have to allow for the difference in time. They have to take off, I don't know, is it a second year or something ridiculous?
Yes, that's a consequence of...
All our sat-navs would be in completely the wrong place. Well, over a period of time it would. So
that's all a consequence of relativity, Einstein's relativity, where time intervals are relative to the position and velocity of the observer. So yes, time's not got that absolute time and space don't have that absolute status
No.
anymore. And again, that's something that sort of a lot of people are very excited about, because it ties up with Eastern philosophical views that time and space emerge at a relatively late stage in the manifestation of consciousness, and there's a whole there's a prior to that there's a sort of eternal dance going on that's not caught up in time at all.
And so you could say all this is happening simultaneously, really.
Yeah.
So that place where that is, you could say, beyond time, is also now.
Yeah.
As well as historical.
Yeah.
And presumably is available in some way, or one can tap into it, maybe.
Yeah, maybe.
No, but you do get a sense of that, don't you, when you meditate, like, timeless.
Yes.
Timeless states.
Yes.
This has always been so, or you know what I mean, like forever. I don't know. Certainly a sense that this is beyond time. Yeah.
I suppose the interesting thing about consciousness conceived of in the materialistic paradigm resulting in self-awareness as the sort of pinnacle. In the other paradigm, that self-awareness, the self-awareness of God, would be the foundation, and you actually get. I think it was the poet Rumi who said, "A million galaxies are but a little scum on that shoreless ocean." So the idea that physical reality, as vast as it appears to us to be, is actually nothing much compared to that ocean of consciousness from which it's all arisen. Time is then the dimension along which that evolution occurs, but it's very much a sideshow. I think from the point of view, I remember when I was studying philosophy at university being immersed in the works of Wittgenstein. He was one of the most influential philosophers of the last century, and there's some of the stuff he wrote in his later notebooks. He said something along the lines of, he says, "It seems that I neglect consciousness, not consciousness as understood from the outside, explained physiologically, but consciousness as itself the essence of the appearance of the world."
Oh, interesting.
So you can see that he was at the point of flipping to the other paradigm, that actually consciousness could be regarded as primary. And he was, in some of his earlier writing as well, in the Tractatus, he was always fascinated by the notion of I, what he called the metaphysical subject. And in fact he talked about the I and the world as two independent godheads. You could almost say that those two paradigms I'm talking about could be regarded as a sort of battle, if you like, between the primacy of the subject or the primacy of the object.
Right.
So a materialist view would be that the objective world is primary. It's entirely out there. It's independent of our perceiving it.
But I mean, this is something that comes up, isn't it, in Kashmir Shaivism and other things. Like we were talking about this earlier, like this whole thing about subject-object relationship. They talk a lot about that when that disappears in a way.
Yes.
There is no observer and observed, or experiencer and experienced.
Right.
That there's somehow then that disappears at some point. And I remember talking to when Jean Klein, I think we used to go to some of those meetings with Jean Klein up in Hampstead, and I remember him I think I asked a question to him because I could never get my head around this idea. He used to talk about it a lot, when this whole thing, there isn't an experience.
Yes.
When the experiencer,
Yes.
And the experienced.
Yes.
I guess because I could never get my head around the fact that there could be a point where that disappears. You know what I mean?
Right.
Because we tend to see everything from that point of view, don't we? So an experience and an experiencer, an I, and something outside.
Yes. But actually, John, it's very familiar to us. I mean, a little bit of reflection would reveal that. For example, yes, we tend to think in terms of our experience as being, subject and object, and there's the object out there, and I'm over here, and it's independent of me and separate from me, and I happen to be experiencing it.
Yeah.
But at the same time, there's plenty of scope for occasions where that seems to dissolve, even in a rather mundane way. So, for example, I can look over there at that sofa and see, well, that sofa's there, it's independent of me.
Yeah.
It's there if I turn away, I assume. That's how I think of it anyway. But there are occasions, like, for example, if I had an itch in my foot.
Yeah.
Okay. You can't have an itch that's unperceived.
No.
Yeah, it can't exist independently of me. It can't just be...
Well, maybe it could. You might have
be,
some irritation that you don't actually feel.
How would it be irritating if you can't feel it?
Well,
it wouldn't be irritating if you can't feel it.
Yeah, but it could... you could have the qualities that could create irritation.
But that's a different thing.
All right. Yeah.
I'm talking about the itch itself.
Yeah, okay, fine. Yeah.
Okay, so there's an itch itself. That there are no itches floating about out there independently of the perception of them.
No.
Yeah.
Sure.
And in fact, there's a profound mystery, Wittgenstein even explored it, about the relationship to our own body.
Yeah.
Because on the one hand, it seems objective. I look at my foot. If I lost my foot tomorrow, I'd still be me. So in a certain sense, the foot is independent of me.
Yeah.
But at the same time, if you hurt that foot, you hurt me.
Yeah.
So it's also dependent.
Sure.
So there's a very blurry line about the independence of the perceiver from the perceived, even in a very mundane sense.
Actually, that's true, and also the reality of it as well. I mean, there's been a lot of interesting research projects about pain and our perception of pain,
right?
Particularly, and or our perception of our body, and sensation and how real that is. And I mean, for example, they've done loads of research like that. You can get mirrors. You can get someone with their arms like that, but it's actually a rubber arm.
A rubber. I've seen that.
It looks. Looking from this perspective, it looks like it's your arm.
Yeah.
And then you put a pin in it, and they go ow.
Ow. Yeah.
They really feel it.
Yes. Yes.
It's not just
yes.
They've done lots of research like this.
Yes.
So.
Yes.
And that has huge ramifications about things like chronic pain and what pain really means or what perception means.
Right.
And I mean, there's a whole part of our brain devoted called the insular cortex, which is kind of deep within our brain, which is all about what this buzzword now is interoception, which is like what your body feels like.
Right.
And that's a perception
of
your body.
Right.
And there's part of your brain which is doing some really, really complicated stuff. It's not just quite simple.
Right.
It'll put it into, like, if you have an accident, for example, you had a fall, the brain will, it's not just a simple thing where you get a nerve impulse from your knee or whatever to your brain and, and that, it's all about how it's perceived or what the meaning is behind it.
Right.
Because then that will indicate whether you need to do something about it or not. You know what I mean? Like,
right.
There's an amazing guy called Lorimer Moseley who talks a lot about this, and he talks in one of his videos about going through the bush in Australia and brushing up against some brushwood or something. So he gets a little bit of scratch on the side of his leg, and the next thing he knows he's in hospital because he's been bitten by a brown snake, which is deadly.
Okay, right.
But because in his previous life, in his childhood, he had a lot of situations like that where he was walking through the bush and you get scratched, and so his brain thought,
ignore it.
Yeah. And so then after that, when he was also walking through the bush again, and he had a similar thing, and this time it was just a scratch, he perceived it as excruciating pain. So
right,
like, you know what I mean?
Right.
So
yes.
because of the meaning of it, and because
Yes.
the perception was that, you need to do something about this.
Yes. Yes.
And that was kind of embarrassing because obviously it just turned out to be a scratch. You know what I mean? So it is. It's like it's not a simple thing. Our body, our brains are doing very, very complicated things in relation to memory, what's happened before, context, meaning. You know what I mean?
It's very interesting that, because what you're looking at is exactly the point where the two paradigms flip.
Yeah.
Because does the body exist in the mind,
Mm-hmm.
or is the mind a product of the mechanism of the body?
Yeah.
And from what you're describing there, although they're talking about it in terms of the way the brain's processing the information, the reality is that our subjective experience of the body
Yeah.
is hugely determined by our state of mind.
Yeah.
That's effectively what you're saying.
Yeah.
You know, that it's not independent and objective out there at all,
Yeah.
and that the body and all its affairs,
Yeah.
in some sense, inhere in consciousness,
Yeah.
in the mind, and not the other way around.
Sure.
Or at least there's a big debate
Yeah.
going on about which way round it is. In fact, we were talking last night about psychosomatic illness,
Yeah.
and how there can be, from a medical point of view, absolutely nothing wrong with you,
Yeah.
and yet for some reason you get into a state of consciousness where you're utterly disabled,
Yeah.
and that's very real
Yeah.
for you.
Sure.
So yeah, that's, again, it's an interesting point, you know,
Yeah.
where you're flipping from one to the other is, you know, is the consciousness of the state of mind primary, or is it
Yeah.
a product,
Yeah.
which is the product of the other,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah, like in chronic diseases, there can be an element of both, can't there? There can be an element of something physical going on, particularly something maybe that triggered it in the first place. And, you know, the way, for example, our nervous system works, and we were talking just about the way the vagus operates and how that might be affected by certain conditions, even physical conditions like inflammation or some, you know, like we're talking about things like tick bites, like Lyme's disease, how that affects the nervous system, and then how I suppose then how that changes one's perception of what's going on a very physical level as well. It's very complicated, isn't it? Because part of what, you know, it's obvious, like our ability to function in this world is dependent a lot on being able to filter out so much stuff.
Yes. Yes.
You know, I mean, there's a part of your brain called the reticular formation, for example, and its job is to filter out all this stuff coming from your body.
Yeah.
All these, I mean, because it's such a sensitive thing, our body, isn't it?
Yeah.
And what is important and what is not important.
Yeah.
That's what its job is.
Yeah. And not only your body. I mean.
Yeah, from where we are, and what you know, and
I remember
really, you know, if well, I suppose you know, you get this in meditative states and things where maybe the filter begins to let go of it.
Yes, exactly. I mean, I went to a lecture last year by Professor David Nutt, who was always been very interested in psychedelic experience, and he was basically saying that the way all of these psychedelic experiences, drug-induced ones, function, is not that you're in some kind of strange hallucination. All they seem to do, the common factor, is simply suppress that filter that you're talking about. So you're simply seeing more of reality.
Yeah.
So it's not a hallucination in that sense. It's not necessarily a delusion.
Yeah.
It's just that it might feel rather weird because you're not capable of processing all that extra information that's coming in.
Yeah.
Because your normal filters have been suspended by the action of the drug.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if you're looking at the whole spectrum of consciousness, I mean, it's.
But yeah, so I mean, coming back to this whole thing about, because this started with this whole thing about I and so an object and a perceiver, or an experiencer.
Yes.
Experiencer.
So I was talking about cases, quite mundane cases, where that, like, you know, like with the case of an itch or whatever, but also, you know, more profound experiences, like, remember that T.S. Eliot poem about where you become so absorbed in the music that you are the music.
Yeah, sure.
So, you know, states of absorption where the subject and the object. I mean, one example was a model that was used. What's that one here? If this handkerchief represents reality, you could say that there are a tension or a polarization occurs between one end of it and the other.
Mm-hmm.
It's one handkerchief, but it's possible to see it in such a way that you have a subject and an object, and the subject is perceiving the object, and they looks like they're separate, two separate. And if your focus is there, then that's how it appears. But in reality, of course, it's just one. So it's not really like this sees that. It's just seeing. And there is no object or subject really. And there are plenty of, for example, in that text that we were looking at a little while ago, the Vijnana Bhairava, with its 112 techniques of meditation. There are plenty of examples in there of being in situations where that apparent duality, which is how we think of things a lot of the time, simply is revealed. It's not that it dissolves, because nothing happens. It's just that you suddenly see that it never was. There never was a separate subject and object. And there are those meditation techniques where, absorbed in the sound of a musical instrument, supreme consciousness can reveal itself, and even things like sneezing. The moment of a sneeze, or sexual orgasm, or whatever. Suddenly something happens where that duality is obliterated. But instead of thinking of it as some kind of peak experience or something unusual, that's actually the status quo all the time. It's just that somehow or other we have superimposed over that the idea that there are these two things going on. And the yoga philosophy is quite good about all of that, because it also says not only have we created this illusion of the subject and the object, but that we're also caught up in what they call false self-identification. Asmita is the word they use in Patanjali uses in his Yoga Sutras, where you not only see yourself as separate, but you then actually, because there's a lack of awareness about the whole, you actually identify with an object. So for example, falsely identify with an object. So for example, if you're, I don't know, very attached to your bank balance, when your bank balance goes down, you get miserable. When your bank balance goes up, you get happy. So the quality of your state is dependent upon, that's false self-identification. You're identifying.
I remember that story about that guy with the car, sports car, and saying to someone, "You touch my car, you touch me."
Well, that's exactly it. That's exactly perfect. That's absolutely perfect. And I mean, life is absolutely chock full of all of that. You're a politician and you're identified with being a politician, and you lose your seat, you're miserable. You're a barrister and you lose the case in court, you're miserable. And I mean, like, absolutely chock full of this whole. So that's why they talk about this process of you identify with some object, and then anything that threatens that object you will be averse to, because you think it's you, and anything that bolsters that identification you will like, because that seems to reinforce you. And they talk about it, raga and dvesha, attraction and repulsion. And the worst one of all is to...
So they talk about going beyond that, don't they?
Yes, the whole point is to say, well, this is what's going on. You're identified with this object, or this range of objects. So the first step is to step back.
Right.
So to make a difference.
Yeah.
Now this can be a source of great confusion for people, because they think, I thought we were supposed to be talking about oneness here, and yet what you're talking about is being detached.
Right.
But what they're talking about is this undoing this false self-identification. So we're separating the subject from the object in the first instance. But only en route to seeing that really there was no subject and there was no object. And that this whole situation generated illusions, quite powerful illusions that affect us greatly. Illusions regarding both the object and the subject. I mean in classical Vedanta, the illusion regarding the object, the famous one, is the snake and the rope.
Yeah.
The coil of rope lying on the floor in a dimly lit room, and you think it's a snake, and so you're frightened, and it causes all sorts of problems for you. We've talked about this before.
Yeah.
Needlessly, because you've misperceived the object, because of your relationship of either attraction or aversion to it. And those really are the two modes. If you're in separation, you can either be attracted to it or averse to it.
Yeah.
But there's also illusions regarding the subject. Mm-hmm. And one of my favourite, you remember those teaching stories of the Sufis with that comic character, the Mullah Nasruddin?
Oh yeah.
Do you remember those?
Yeah.
There's one that I really like, which springs to mind, where somebody goes up to Mullah Nasruddin and says to him, your wife's cheating on you. And he says, really? And he gets really upset and really angry. And who and where? And he says, well, I can tell you where she meets her lover. And they meet on the roof terrace late at night. So he said, I'll show her. So he goes up on the roof terrace and he climbs up a tree, keeps himself hidden where he can see everything. And he's sitting there waiting, and the sun goes down and it gets quite dark and everything. He's waiting for his wife and her lover to appear. Yeah. And it's getting a bit dark. And he's saying, it's getting a bit dark. Am I even going to be able to recognise her? And he says, I better bring to mind, visualise what she looks like, so I'll be able to recognise her even in the dark. And then he has trouble trying to visualise what she looks like. Uh-huh. And then suddenly it dawns on him that he hasn't got a wife. And he's never had a wife.
That's very good. Oh dear.
So, illusion, this creates illusions.
Right.
Yeah. False identification, ideas of not only what the object is, but what the subject is. Uh-huh. And so that the seeing of the oneness is at the same time a dispelling of those illusions.
But I suppose from sort of human point of view, that is kind of hardwired into us, isn't it, as we incarnate? This whole separation between experiencer and experienced. I don't know, it's kind of built into our nervous systems in a way. It's quite difficult to disentangle it. From the point of...
What, things like having a fight or flight syndrome, or, this...
Well, just, when we incarnate and we're in, there's a separation between us and... we emerge, don't we, from a merging of an egg and a sperm, right?
Yeah.
Those two things, which are basically the biggest cell in the body and the smallest cell in the body, come together, and then they form one. Mm-hmm. And then they divide. So it's a really weird process. It's 2 to 1 in the egg that's formed from the union of the two. Becomes one thing. And then it starts to divide quite quickly. Mm-hmm. And it becomes lots. And then you get this, and then it implants. Mm-hmm. And then you get a relationship through the umbilical cord with the mother. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? So it's like all this intricate stuff happens. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, it grows, and then the baby grows, and then it has this relationship. So there's a clear relationship between what this eye of the baby is and the eye of the mother and all that kind of stuff.
Yes.
Whatever it is, I think. So it's interesting. I was reading this thing about in Canada. I don't know if this is still true, but in Canada, there's this law about when a human being actually becomes a human being.
I was going to mention that before.
And
yes.
And in Canada, it was different in different countries.
Right.
But you're only a human being when you've separated from your mother. So in other words, at the moment of cutting the cord after you're born, then you're a human being.
Right, really.
It's interesting. I mean, I don't know how that applies to, abortion laws and all that kind of stuff in Canada or whatever. But yeah, that was in their kind of constitution.
Right.
Which is an interesting idea, isn't it? When you're separate from something.
Yes.
You are
then you have an identity. Yes.
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 But anyway, so it's kind of hardwired into our nervous system, really, this thing about a perception and also that perception is somehow real, that we have to believe somehow that it's real, so it contains our experience somehow. It contains all this stuff we're exposed to, that there is somehow a centre, which is an I, from which then we can relate to everything else, that in order for us to function.
But that, I think, is precisely the illusion.
Yes, definitely it's an illusion.
That there is
Yes,
no
but what I'm
central-
saying is it's hardwired into us to
Yeah, well,
behave like that.
I'm not sure how hardwired that really is, because all that's required is that we're capable of functioning. We function. I mean, in one way, you could say that we're hardwired to function well, and that the idea of an I, a separate I, is a sort of add-on. It's like an intruder almost. It's falsely appropriating.
Absolutely, it's completely falsely appropriated.
Falsely appropriating the whole thing.
But within that thing, it has to have a reality to it in order to be able to function. There has to be an illusion of reality to that sense of I.
But I don't think that that's necessary for functioning.
Well, no,
I mean,
I don't think so either. But,
I can give you an example. The other day, I was driving quite fast on the motorway and nearly got wiped out.
Yeah.
But what was interesting to me was that when I look back in detail at what I actually experienced, was that there was, before I knew anything, there was this rush of fear through my body.
Sure.
And I responded.
Yes.
When I say I responded, actually I didn't.
Yeah.
There was a response.
Yeah.
There was a rush of fear, a response, and I turned the wheel and everything was fine.
But you see, when you talk about fear, that's an interpretation of what you're experiencing.
Well, I'm describing. Yes,
it's a bodily sensation that you say is fear.
Well, I say
actually,
yes, I say it now.
It's not.
Is fear, but it was just a visceral response.
Yeah.
And I functioned well. It got me out of trouble. But the idea that I wasn't even and again, it's hard not to say it that way. But what I noticed was that my reaction and my response happened before.
Sure.
I was aware of it.
Yeah.
So the idea that it was me, that I had got myself out of trouble, is just not true.
Yeah.
You know, the idea that it had happened to me and that I had responded, blah, 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 none of that's true.
Yeah.
There was simply the functioning.
Sure.
There was a threat, a response,
Mm.
and then it was over. And then I come in afterwards and start claiming to be the subject of all that experience and as the actor in it.
Yeah.
But I wasn't.
Yeah.
I mean, it just happened. You know.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's interesting. And then beyond that also, you've probably heard about this experiment. It was done fairly recently with students where they're showed images of certain things, either nice or nasty images. It could be of different qualities, disturbing images or nice images.
Right.
And the monitoring their response in terms of their nervous systems. And their nervous systems would respond to the image before they actually saw it.
Right.
I don't know if you've heard this.
Yes, I have heard this. Yes.
Which is bizarre.
Yes.
That there is some sort of knowing of what is coming somehow before it actually comes.
Well, it relates to another set of famous experiments where basically you are informed of your state of mind after the event.
True. Yes.
And there were other experiments done where people would be advancing a slideshow with a trigger.
Yeah.
And the minute they got bored with the thing, they press the button and they see the next picture.
Uh-huh.
But when they measured their brain activity, there was a spike in the brain activity that indicated that they're now bored with that image and wanted to move on.
Mm-hmm.
But that spike occurred before they pressed the button.
Right. Uh-huh.
So what they actually got was they changed the mechanism so that the slide was moved forward not by the trigger, but by the spike in the brain activity.
Right.
And they were very disturbed by that.
Oh, really?
Because what they experienced was that the damn thing was reading my mind. It was moving on before
How was this done?
I'll have to look at the reference for you. But the whole point was that you think I got bored, so I pressed the trigger and the slide moved on.
Yeah.
No, not at all.
Right.
That feeling of you being bored, the original impulse of it happened as below your level of awareness. Mm-hmm. And you thought that you were the author of it and that you were responding to something. Mm-hmm. You weren't responding to something. It had already happened. Mm-hmm. The impulse to act had already arisen,
Sure.
and you're just following.
Yeah,
on
but that's a
that.
reaction in the body, isn't it? I guess somehow that's then interpreted by the brain or something, isn't it?
Yeah, but the point about when they wired up the trigger to
Yeah.
to your brain activity rather than you yourself
Yeah.
was that your brain activity was moving the slide on, but
Yeah.
you only were informed of the fact afterwards,
Yeah.
and that's why you were spooked by it,
Yeah.
because you thought it was reading your mind.
Yeah.
So
Yes. I mean, you know.
so that anyway, the upshot of all of that is that I don't. When you said we're hardwired to have that delusion in order
Yeah.
to be able to function, I actually don't think so.
Okay.
I actually think we function perfectly well, can function perfectly well, without that. Probably better actually,
Yeah.
because the intervening of that sense of I
Well,
causes all sorts of,
absolutely.
those illusions I was talking about. False identification.
Yes, and then that sense of false identification seems to be more. I don't know. I suppose in some philosophies it's described as more of a density, isn't it? Like there's
Yes.
more lightness as the more you can separate yourself out from that.
Yes.
Like and I suppose in certain kind of situations where you're deeply identified with your job, or and it seems to create then this horrible reaction if you lose your job.
Yes.
Where you're devastated for years.
Yes.
You know what I mean? And then
Yes.
other people will be just
Yes.
It's like just strange. But just could say, I mean, this is slightly going off the point, but I mean, you probably know some of. You mentioned Rupert Sheldrake and his stuff. I mean, he wrote a book called The Science Delusion. I don't know if you've seen that, which was a sort of antidote to the God Delusion, Dawkinson book. And I heard him. We had him at a conference a few years ago, and he was. I mean, he's a hilarious guy. But he also wrote a book. This book called Dogs Who Know when their owners are coming home, or something like that. Something like
he did experiments with.
Yeah, lots of that.
Yeah,
and also he did an experiment actually with. I think he said Richard Wiseman's dog. Richard Wiseman's an arch skeptic. even his dog. He was rather disturbed with that. But he showed a wonderful thing. I think it was shown on BBC or Channel 4 or something years ago. With this experiment with this parrot. Did you ever see that?
No.
Yes, it was hilarious. And this parrot's quite close to its owner, but they put the parrot in some apartment block, in a separate apartment block, and the owner was shown images. And this parrot had quite a good vocabulary apparently, so he could say, what the image was, like it would be flowers or something.
Okay.
So you had this woman looking at these images and sort of slowly concentrating, and the parrot would be filmed in another apartment block.
Right.
And it would, when the owner looked at this flower, you could see the parrot saying pretty flower," like this.
Brilliant.
It's great. If you could get it might be on YouTube or something. It's so funny. He's such a character. But anyway, that comes back to something else really. So where were we?
Yeah, we were talking about. Well, you mentioned about Kashmir Shaivism and.
Oh yes, and this thing. Well, I mean, this is something that I find quite interesting when you look at kind of spiritual practice and stuff like this, which because I live near Glastonbury, you see this all the time particularly in the New Age circles, but also in other things as well, where people kind of seek out, say, an experience of, experience of unity or experience of whatever it is, or some higher kind of consciousness is a goal of some spiritual practice or something like this.
Right.
And which you could say will only ever be an experience.
Yeah.
Nothing.
Yeah.
You can't say anything. I mean, it might have consequences for your life, and obviously, changing it and and stuff. But as a goal. And I do have some issues with that, because it's so different when you look at it, and in Kashmir Shaivism they talk about this thing of this disappearing of the experience and the experiencer. They talk about like how a sage, what is the difference between an ordinary person and a sage, and the ordinary person will perceive objects, and the sage also perceives objects, but he knows that there is no difference, or that there is. You know what I mean? That's the difference. That that a sage knows that is an illusion. Fundamentally, that is 100% clear. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it comes back to that very simple model again, that as long as you're thinking of yourself as this subject, you want to acquire some kind of experience.
Yeah.
That experience will be some passing state.
Yes.
And you're trying to make it permanent.
Yeah, I mean, that was always a frustration for me, when, you know, in terms of...
You reach some exalted state.
And those states are so attractive and
some of them are. Yeah.
Amazing.
Yes.
Not to be sniffed at, but I'm not dissing them because they're wonderful. But but yeah, within that there was also frustration about coming back to kind of reality somehow, or coming back to a state where, and then within that almost an obsessive craving for those kind of high states.
Yes.
And also then this thought, if you're enlightened, then you will be in a constant state of bliss. Yeah. Which I, no. or whatever. Or that, yes, I mean it can be a bit of a trap, can't it? I think, and I think it's very difficult to get your head around. I can never get my head around this thing about this disappearance of this experience thing.
But it's but John, it's not a disappearance. It's simply, at any time, whether it's like this or like this or like this or like this, nothing's changed.
No.
I mean,
no,
nothing's changed. So any kind of mode of experience is possible. I mean, I'll give you an example. In this, we're talking about, there's your subject, there's the object.
Yeah.
The disappearance of the subject just simply means the revelation of the whole handkerchief.
Sure, that it was never separate.
It was never separate in the first place.
Exactly.
But the different approaches are, for example, and it's quite interesting, one way of dissolving the illusion that they are separate is simply to say there's no subject, there's no self. And a lot of non-dual teachings, and Buddhist teachings in particular, have that as their kind of mainstay. But the main thing is to realise there's no... Because if that goes, well, this is just part of this. So there's no... The object as object also disappears. So the emphasis is on realise no self. And that's always been the sort of cornerstone. But it's also, in other traditions, realise that the object has no independent existence. It's all the self. So this end of the polarity drops out. It's all the self, capital S, not little s ego, self ego, but it's all, So they talk about the big I am, as opposed to I am the little separate ego. And of course that's philosophically been a bone of contention between the philosophical traditions about whether you emphasise the disappearance of the self and emptiness, or whether you emphasise the disappearance of the objective reality as having any independent existence, and it's all you in some sense, but not you as you normally take yourself to be.
So you were talking about this earlier, that the sort of dispute that's been going on for a long time between Buddhism and Vedanta, is that right? Yes,
I mean Buddhism was, as I said, had this doctrine of anatman, there is no self. So they're always emphasising that disappearance of the, not even the disappearance because it never was, but realising that. As opposed to Vedanta, which is always talking about Atman, which is the same as Brahman, so all is the self. Now those two approaches can seem to be in contradiction to one another. But just using the simple model of my handkerchief, you can see that they're really, in the end, they amount to the same thing. And the description in Kashmir Shaivism, and the description of the process of manifestation, they talk about, one consciousness, Paramashiva, whatever, and this polarity appears to develop. And in the beginning, there's this polarization of I and that. Well, there's still recognition that it's one. It's just that there's a beginning of a polarization. And so there is the beginning of an idea of a self, and this is the Shiva Tattva, the supreme I, the I sense of God. Becomes aware that it's all him or her. So that's the beginning of, but it's not yet separation. So in those early other 5 tattvas in the beginning of the description of the manifestation in Cosmic Shaivism, where oneness is not disturbed, although there's the beginning of that polarization, they call it Shiva and Shakti, and so there's a description of it. And it's very much related to levels of energy. Now at some point they talk about there being the eclipse of the sense of oneness, and that then there's a split between the Purusha and Prakriti are the terms they use. So there appears to be a separation. But it is, of course, illusory in a way. Although in Shaivism they don't really talk about it as illusory. They more talk about it in terms of energy. But the appearance of separation is due to a contraction and an increased density in the energy, what you talked about earlier. And that in a certain sense that if the energy of consciousness is raised, it's no longer possible to sustain that separation. So there are, and that's where it all gets rather tricky, because you do get these traditions where the raising of one's energy becomes a goal, with the idea that if you raise the energy of consciousness enough, then all of that separation must kind of boil off, evaporate away. But the catch-22 of all of that is, well, why are you doing it? Are you doing it in service to the separate subject who wants to have that experience? Because in another sense then you're simply reinforcing the illusion you're trying to eliminate. So that's the whole paradox of spiritual practice. Who is it that's practicing and why? Because it's one anyway. You know, and that's really I mean it's a kind of a koan, it's a kind of a paradox really. Any kind of experience is possible. I mean that experience of being the self, the big I am, it's like you're experiencing yourself as God, and the whole of the objective world is your body. That's the object, and the whole of manifestation is your body. And you are the God. God. God is a state of consciousness where the universe appears as your body. But it's actually no more significant, really, than any other mode of experience, because it's still in that. It's still in that framework of duality. I mean, what you described in terms of the fertilization of the egg, and that, in a way, on a sort of physical level, it's like a sort of paralleled in Shaivism's description of the universe sort of beginning to split into two. And then that creates a kind of cascade effect in which, out of the original pair, there's a sort of cascade of consequences. Of it can be divided and divided and divided, and and different things appear out of that. And they have 36 levels of creation, and the task of the yogi is to kind of ravel it all up again. To reverse the process. It's all of that stuff's incredibly alluring.
It is. It is.
So I suppose in terms of our the original question about consciousness and awareness, I mean they're kind of interchangeable really, those terms, but I suppose it is of some use to talk about awareness could be the subject aware of an object. Whereas consciousness could be more seen as the recognition of the oneness. So that's a useful distinction, you could say. And then there's always the, in some ways, more intriguing concept of what is prior to consciousness, because that's a term that's bandied around as well. And that's kind of interesting, because there's a certain sense in which, I think it was in Jnaneshwar's The Nectar of Self-Awareness. Lovely. We've quoted that before. There's those wonderful bit where he describes the unity of consciousness, the subject, the object and the subject are part of one reality. So the nectar creates a bee in order that it can be tasted. and the melody creates an ear in order that it can be heard. It's all beautiful stuff. And the Sufis have a thing about I was a hidden treasure, and I long to be known, so I created the world. So there's that idea that you could say there is a purpose, although it's tricky language to use, in that the manifestation of consciousness is the self-revelation of that. But at the same time, when you talk about, well, that whole thing is in a certain sense we talk about arising from nothing. It's like you cannot be conscious of what's prior to consciousness. You cannot know what's...
Is this coming back to what you were saying before about emptiness? And really?
You cannot know. It's unknowable. I mean, there's a certain no getting around the fact that there's a mystery there. And there's no way the mind can get... There's simply no way the mind can grasp it, because the mind is only a tool. Any more than the hand can grasp.
But is that not also what we came back to before about the experience and the experiences, where those are seen to be inseparable? But then there isn't an experiencer to perceive what you're talking about. It just is. So it's not an experience. It just is. But there is a knowing in that, and that's interesting. So what is knowing? What is knowing?
Muktananda wrote that little booklet, didn't he, to know the knower. And the idea that there is a knowingness in that, not a separate knowingness of a subject that knows an object. But it's inherent in it. There's a knowingness in it.
But do you not think that also maybe comes back to what we were talking about before, the nature of consciousness, as there is an element of that awareness or knowing within that state of original consciousness somehow, that is all pervasive, that within that there is this in the same way. I find it very interesting, this sort of pull. There's always a pull, I suppose, from, it feels to me like there's a pull outwards to it for expression of something of divinity or some knowing, that it always kind of wants to express itself. I suppose that's sort of Shiva Shakti thing, isn't it, as well? That Shakti thing about wanting to express. So as soon as there is some kind of revelation, it wants to express itself somehow.
Yes, but there is a perspective, that's true, but there is a perspective from which that is all, in some sense, what's the right word, kind of a sideshow. I mean, it's not necessary.
Absolutely.
There's one analogy I like that you mentioned Jean Klein earlier. There's one analogy I've always liked of his, where he talks about, he says, imagine that you've got this lovely hanging carpet on your wall. And it's been there a long, long time and everything. And without you knowing, somebody takes it down to have it cleaned. And you come back home and you look over to where the carpet normally is. What do you see? He says you don't see the wall. What you see is the absence of the carpet. Okay. And the analogy he's using there is that in a sense the carpet could be said to be the entirety of consciousness and its content. Then there's a possibility of its absence, which would be what a Buddhist would call the void, shunya, nothingness. But the reality underlying it that makes it possible is the wall. And it's entirely and completely incidental to the wall, whether it has a carpet hanging on it or not. It's nothing to do with the wallness of the wall, that it has or has not got a carpet on it. So my take on all of that is that, in a certain sense, the knowingness inherent in consciousness is not something that is, in a sense, you approach the mystery as unknowable. But nonetheless, it's also that which makes consciousness possible. It's not in the sense that analogy is then not right, because it's what is unknowable appears as what is knowable. It's not like there's a separate thing. So that the analogy of the wall and the carpet's not good in that sense. It's not that there's something separate that's prior to consciousness. It is that. It appears as that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's hard to find the words for it. It appears as that. It's not different.
Sure.
In that sense, the desire to know it is part of the same.
But yes, I mean that's kind of what Yanis was talking about, isn't it? There is this impulse within it, which probably comes, later in a way that there appears to be this kind of dynamic where it wants to express itself, or it wants to be known.
Yes.
And there's a knowingness. It wants to be, God wants to be known somehow. So, like you're talking about, like how a scent will create a nose in order for it to experience,
realize its potentiality, or realize its possibility.
There's something very beautiful in that, isn't there? Really quite alluring and beautiful.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it's sort of not irrelevant, but it's what was it that quote in the saga that he talks about how the sense of I, the mind, needs a center to draw a circumference, and that can be expanded and expanded and expanded and expanded and expanded to include any number of wonderful states of consciousness and potentialities. But he says at some point it's given up as being realised as sort of unnecessary.
Yeah.
And the circumference, the bubble is pricked, and there's no longer a centre, or there are centres everywhere, to put it that way. And from that point of view, it doesn't matter if the bubble's tiny, or is a very contracted experience, or whether it's a more expanded one, or even expanded out to God consciousness.
Yeah.
In a certain sense, it's all the same.
Sure.
From that point of view.
Yeah. Sure. And what I was saying before about this sort of biological thing where this sense of an I is obviously essentially illusory, but we create it in order to have some frame of reference somehow. Yeah. Because otherwise there isn't any frame of reference, because the reality is there isn't a centre.
Yes.
Not really.
Yes. Yeah, there is no reference point.
No, not really.
No.
Yeah, so...
that was Sufi saying, when all are swimming in the infinite ocean, who is nearer the shore? There isn't.
Yeah. Good. Anything else you want to say? Just go before we face the reality of London and the cold, the wind.
I think that's probably enough for now.
Okay.
That was very enjoyable. Thank you.
We could revisit this at another point.
We certainly will, I think.
God.
Like a moth to the flame. You can't resist talking about it.
Great, thank you.
Thanks, Tim. That was great fun.